I shouldn't have boarded that train, but you know how it is, don't you? Curiosity pushes you, and you end up making stupid choices. That's how I ended up on the Night Express, a legend everyone in Scotland knows but no one believes. And I, like the fool I am, decided to see if the story was real. They say the train only appears on nights of thick fog when the hills seem to merge with the sky. It always departs from the same station, a forgotten stop in the middle of nowhere called Call Isla, named after the whiskey the locals love so much. Around there, the howling wind of the Highlands seems to always try to whisper secrets to you. Call Isla was just another faded point on the map, a station forgotten by time. But on those nights, it turned into a gateway to something different. I'd heard enough about the Night Express in taverns, while men filled their cups and laughed at tourists who asked questions about the legend. It's just a story, lad. They'd say their faces flushed from whiskey and cigarette smoke. But if you ever see it, don't board, no matter how much it calls to you. Of course I boarded, because when the fog began to rise that night and I saw the train appear, its silhouette of aged iron cutting through the air like a cold whisper, I couldn't resist. As soon as I stepped in, the air changed. It wasn't just the cold from the hills, it was something else, denser, like time itself was trapped in that carriage. The lights flickered occasionally, just enough for me to see the velvet-lined seats, faded red, the silk curtains worn and tattered, and the passengers strange. It wasn't that they were ugly or deformed. It was something subtle, almost imperceptible. The way some didn't blink, the way their bodies seemed strange, like they were slightly out of focus. You know when something's wrong, but you can't quite explain it. Yeah, that was the vibe. I sat next to an elderly lady wearing a fur coat that smelled like mildew. She didn't look at me, but her lips moved, murmuring something. A prayer? Maybe. Across the aisle, a man in a felt hat, holding a pocket watch. He opened and closed it rhythmically. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Always the same movement, like he was waiting for something. I started wondering what the hell I was doing there. Why I, of all fools, had decided to board that train. I should have gotten off at the first stop, but every time I thought of it, a strange sensation held me back, like the seats themselves were gripping me. The train gained speed, but the world outside didn't move, just endless fog. That's when the lights flickered again, and I saw something. A shadow, or rather, a blurry figure. In the window's reflection, I saw a tall, hooded man standing in the corridor between the carriages. I turned quickly, but no one. Just the old lady's endless mumbling and the tick-tock of the watch. What the hell was going on? I moved to the corridor. The air was heavier there. The walls seemed to breathe, swelling and contracting like the train had lungs. And with each breath, I felt something following me. A dense, metallic smell filled the air. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy. Who's there? I shouted, more to myself than anyone. Silence. Only the distant sound of the wheels on the tracks, like a slow drumbeat. I went back to my seat, but it wasn't there anymore. The carriage looked different, as if its layout had changed. Every door I opened led me back to the same corridor, like I was stuck in an endless loop. I started running, opening door after door, always ending up in the same place, until finally I found the engine room. The conductor was there, his back to me. The room was covered in ancient instruments, gauges showing impossible pressures, clocks with broken hands spinning out of control. You know what's happening here. My voice was desperate but firm. He didn't answer. His hand gripped the controls tightly. So I touched his shoulder. Slowly he turned. And what I saw was like staring into emptiness. It wasn't a violent sight, but it consumed me. I stumbled back into the corridor. Now the voices began. low whispers in languages I couldn't understand, a macabre chorus following me through the carriage. The passengers' figures started to disintegrate little by little, and with each inch that disappeared from them, something inside me faded too. A piece of who I was slipped away with every moment. I knew I was nearing the end. And now here I am, standing in the corridor, feeling the train slow down. There's no way out for me, and no matter how much I fought, I know Cal-Isla is calling me back. I can feel the cold of the iron surrounding me, the sound of the tracks devouring me. I told you the train only appears for those who can't escape what's coming, and guess what? I'm one of them.
You know, I never believed in those stories. The ones you hear at station bars, about trains going nowhere, passengers disappearing. Nonsense, I always thought. Until I had to take the train. The old rusty one that snakes through the mountains of a forgotten region in Colombia. The name of the line, Ruta del Silencio, or the Silent Route. Not exactly a reassuring name when I didn't have a choice, and frankly, who still believes in those legends. I boarded the train as dusk fell, the sky a deep red, almost blood-like, swallowed by the distant mountains. The train itself had a few old cars, probably from when my grandfather was a kid. Inside, just a handful of passengers. Ordinary people, from what I could tell at a glance. Peasants with sun-hardened faces, quiet as if silence was the rule. The clatter of the tracks, that repetitive, monotonous sound, was already getting on my nerves. It was like a broken clock, a relentless tick-tock that wouldn't stop. A growing discomfort gnawed at me as the train moved deeper into the countryside, far from civilization. I tried to relax, but the silence of the other passengers was unsettling. They didn't look at anything, just stared into space. Then he appeared, the conductor. Pale-faced, lifeless eyes, like someone who had long given up on existing. He walked down the aisle without looking at anyone, a presence I'd called ghostly, if I believed in that sort of thing. He ignored me, as if I were part of the furniture. Typical, I thought. These guys never have a good day, but the unease stayed, growing like a tumor. Outside, the day began to die, and with it, what was left of the light. We passed through tunnels that seemed endless, each one darker and more claustrophobic than the last. With every tunnel, the air grew colder, as if the train was crossing into another world. I felt strange, like something was watching me from the other side of the metal walls. But it wasn't just paranoia. It was real. There was something there, I knew it. And then the first passenger vanished. I didn't notice it at first. An old man sitting a few seats away from me wearing a big hat, his eyes downcast. When we emerged from a tunnel, he was simply gone. All that remained was his hat, lying on the floor, as if it had been left behind. I looked around, trying to figure out what had happened, but no one reacted. The other passengers didn't move a muscle, didn't show any surprise. That hit me like a punch to the gut. The train kept moving, indifferent. Soon after, we entered another tunnel, even longer. When we came out of the darkness, someone else was gone. This time, a young woman who had been sitting at the front, staring blankly out the window. All that was left was her scarf, draped over the seat as if she'd been sucked away. My heart was racing now. I knew something was wrong, very wrong. But what? No one seemed to care. The train moved forward, impassive, as if the disappearances were just part of the journey. I tried to speak to one of the passengers, a man next to me. His skin seemed even paler than before. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice full of urgency. He just stared at me, his eyes empty like black wells, and then he turned back to the nothingness, as if I didn't exist. I stood up, determined to do something. I had to find the conductor, get some answers from him. I walked through the cars, feeling the weight of something invisible on my shoulders. It was like walking through mud, every step harder. The train seemed alive, reacting to my presence, pushing me back. but I kept going. Finally, I reached the conductor's cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking. Inside, no one, just the control panel, dimly lit by a faint, flickering light, as if it had a will of its own. The train was moving by itself. A chill ran down my spine. This doesn't make sense, I thought. I looked around, but the silence was crushing. And then, out of nowhere, the door to the cabin slammed shut behind me, with a bang that made me jump. The train entered another tunnel, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to end. When the light returned, I felt a presence next to me. I didn't dare look, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Something was there, breathing in sync with me, so close I could feel the cold air on my neck. I stood still, trying to control the panic. Finally, I summoned the courage and slowly turned around. But there was nothing, just emptiness. I tried to go back to my seat, but the car, it had changed. Or maybe it wasn't the car. Maybe it was me. The people were still there, but they weren't the same. Something in them had dimmed. They were motionless, like statues, and I began to wonder if, at some point, I'd end up like that too. Trapped, silent, forgotten. The train didn't stop. Time no longer seemed to have meaning. Everything was tunnel. Everything was darkness. And with each passing moment, I lost more of who I was. The silence was devouring me, bit by bit. And then, as if nothing had happened, the conductor appeared again, his pale face unchanged. He handed me a ticket. "We'll arrive soon," he murmured. But there was no station. There were no visible tracks. There was only the promise of a destination I didn't understand. And on that ticket, scrawled in shaky letters, was something that chilled me to the bone. One of us. I'd looked around. The shadows of the passengers seemed to close in on me. I was the only one who hadn't disappeared, or had I already vanished without realizing it? But I'm still here, or I think I am. Maybe I lost myself somewhere along the tracks, or maybe I was never here to begin with. Now I'd just wait for the next tunnel, the next step on this path that leads nowhere.
Have you ever taken a train in the dead of night? I don't mean the usual ones, those that zigzag through the city carrying tired workers and late students. No, I'm talking about a specific train, one that runs on a line people avoid mentioning. Anyone who's lived in Tokyo long enough has heard the stories about the Hanzomon line, or at least what happens on it between 3 and 4 a.m. But honestly, I never believed any of those stories. Not until that night. It was late, much later than I wanted to be out on the streets. Work stretched my nights, and I had to catch the last train. The air was heavy, humid, typical of the rainy season, the kind of atmosphere that clings to your skin and seems to suffocate you. It was past 3 in the morning when I found myself alone on the platform, except, of course, for the distant sound of the train coming. The train looked old, its carriages worn and out of time, as if they'd been there for decades, even though the line was modern. I boarded the train, and naturally went straight to the last carriage. It's always more comfortable there, fewer people, more room to relax. When the door closed, a faint vibration ran through the floor under my feet, and the train started moving with a metallic screech. The first few minutes were normal, or at least normal for a late night wrapped in that oppressive stillness. But then I noticed something, a small thing, but unsettling. Looking out the window, I realized we weren't moving. The scenery outside, the tracks, the city lights, they were frozen, like a photograph. I stared at it, trying to understand, when the first shiver crawled down my spine. You know, that kind of feeling that tells you something is wrong, really wrong. That's when I saw him, a man sitting at the far end of the carriage. He hadn't been there when I got on. He was hunched over, wearing a hat that obscured his face. I thought he was just another tired commuter, until I noticed something that made me pause. He wasn't breathing. He wasn't moving. He was just there. There was a stillness around him that didn't make sense. Have you ever felt something like that? As if the air around someone is being sucked in, like their presence was a kind of black hole. I tried to ignore it. After all, Exhaustion was already playing tricks on my mind. I closed my eyes for a moment, but then the sound started. Soft, low, a muffled voice, almost imperceptible but growing. It came from the far end of the carriage. When I opened my eyes, the man in the hat was standing, and he was looking at me. The carriage lights began flickering, and the air, once stuffy and humid, suddenly became cold. Too cold. The man started walking towards me, and each step echoed in the empty carriage. With each movement, the moan intensified. It wasn't a normal sound. It was a kind of whisper, something between a plea and a warning. I knew I was about to witness something I shouldn't. Then, in a split second, I heard a sharp crack from another carriage, followed by a scream that seemed to tear reality apart. I can't explain it, but it was as if the air itself had split, leaving a void, an absence. The train, after all, had never really been moving. Before I could do anything, the train shuddered, and for a split second, I saw a female shadow appear in the window's reflection. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a void, a hole in existence. And that's when everything made sense. The man in the carriage wasn't just a man. He was a witness, someone who had already seen what I was seeing now. And like him, I was marked, a prisoner of something I couldn't even begin to understand. The train never stopped, at least not where it should have. The man vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, and I was alone again. When the doors finally opened, the landscape waiting for me was an empty, abandoned station, with moss growing between the tracks and the air thick with an oppressive silence. But you know what's worse? I still take the train. Every day. And every time I board, I feel like I'm getting closer to meeting them again. The man, the woman, and whatever else is lurking between the carriages.